Okay, I'm going to get us started while people trickle in a little late here. Welcome back to our Wildfire Seminar Series. We are so pleased to have Dr. Peter Williams with us today. He was formerly the CTO of IBM's Big Green Innovations Incubator. He also played a major role in IBM's activities in sustainability, water management, smart cities, and disaster risk reduction, or DRR. As IBM's representative to Arise, he was the lead author in the UN's City Disaster Resilience Scorecard, now used by well over 400 cities globally, and has since led the development of several extensions and variants, including the Wildfire Scorecard. Peter co-leads the US network of Arise, the UN's DRR vehicle for public-private collaboration in DRR. As such, he has led numerous projects, including a community toolkit for wildfire risk reduction, mentoring entrants to the DRR sector, and creating action guides for cities and communities becoming disaster resilient. Peter was also named IBM's Distinguished Engineer in 2009. He also taught a course here at Stanford on smart cities and communities. Today, in addition to Arise, he consults on corporate ESG and climate risk issues. He holds a PhD in politics from the University of Bath, England. Welcome, Peter. Glad to have you here today to talk about some important stuff that you've been doing.
Yeah, Derek, thank you very much. Let me just share my screen.
You got it.
Okay. There we go. Okay, can we see that?
Yes, we can. It's all yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to just talk on three different subjects. One, a very quick introduction to Arise. Secondly, some perspectives on disaster risk reduction and some of the different aspects that need to be considered and how, excuse me, how that affects businesses in DRR. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the different dimensions of business to government and government to business engagement. Arise, very briefly, it was established by UNDRR in 2014 to build public-private collaboration in disaster risk reduction. It's an arm's length organization from the UN, but we have a secretariat staffed by UN professionals. The Arise Americas Secretariat is in Panama. We have 37 country networks, give or take, at this point in time. I think it might have just gone up by a couple, actually. We're very strong in North and South America, strong in Southeast Asia, excuse me, becoming stronger in Africa and the Middle East. And for reasons that I've never fully understood, we're not very strong in Europe. I suspect it's because the European Union has tended to fill the kind of vacuum there. Everything we do is pro bono, but everything we create can be used either for profit or non-profit activities. Arise US, as you probably expect, is one of the largest and most active Arise networks around the world. Our stock in trade, each Arise network is different in terms of what they focus on. Ours is on creating tools to help communities become more resilient. And some examples of those are in the links that you can see to the right-hand side of this slide. I presume the slides will be distributed afterwards, and those links will be available to you. So then moving on to talk about some perspectives. The first perspective, and there are kind of six of these really. The first is the interplay between chronic stresses and acute events. And wildfire disaster risk reduction is about both. Chronic stresses can be climatic or environmental. They can be financial, they can be social, they can be cultural, political, and so on. The acute event is the disaster itself. The point being that chronic stresses can predispose a settlement to an acute event or worsen an acute event. For example, if a forest has been allowed to become overgrown over the previous 40, 50 years, it can worsen the impact that a fire might have. Or if there is a drought, it may increase the likelihood of a fire spreading much faster, and so on. But likewise, acute events can exacerbate chronic stresses. And if you've ever seen some of the struggles that rural communities have had to recover after wildfires, to rebuild their societies, rebuild their economies, and so forth, you'll understand exactly what that is about. So you have that interaction between the two, the chronic stresses and the acute events. The second point to note is that wildfire disaster risk reduction is a classic system of systems problem. The risk reduction itself is dependent on the energy, telecommunication systems, water and sanitation, firefighting, ecosystems, the forests, not least, education, and so on. These are just examples. But equally, wildfire risk affects systems such as land and property, economic activity and business, social, public systems, air and water quality, health systems, and so on. So you get this sort of system of systems interaction. And the corollary of that, of course, is that point interventions in one of those systems may or may not have knock-on implications in some of the others. And that becomes a key feature in actually determining what your disaster risk reduction approach needs to be. Fighting wildfire risk involves actions over multiple time periods, multiple timescales. There's multi-decadal action, so long-run exposure predictions and so forth, and looking at the likely increase in things like urban boundaries. A decadal scale, land use decisions, consumption patterns, community layout, major infrastructure hardening and duplication. Those are things that take a decade or more to either line up or to achieve. You then get progressively shorter timescales as you go through, with things like building code revisions, which can take, let's say, 5 years. Emergency planning and simulation, which may take some number of years to get together. Business and home hardening, and so on. And then down to the months and weeks. And then to the period immediately before a wildfire erupts. There's one in the next valley. It may come over the hill within an hour or two. What do you do about that? Evacuation and property securing, enhanced law and order presence, enhanced firefighting presence, and so forth, and event tracking. But then the same thing happens out the other side of the fire itself. There's actions that you'll be undertaking in the hours and days right after the wildfire, during and after the wildfire, in the weeks and months after that, and then in the years to the sub-decade after that. And if you consider that the town of Paradise, just to take one example I happen to know, has about 30% rebuilt after the Paradise fire in 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago, you'll understand why and how that can take so long. And tragically, I suspect that the residents of Altadena and Palisades in California, in Los Angeles, are going to find the same thing. Wildfire risk reduction also requires action over multiple spatial scales. There's things you've got to do at the level of the individual property, home hardening and business fire hardening. There are things you've got to do at the community scale, whether you're talking about urban layouts, building codes, social connections that you're trying to build around emergency management, emergency prevention, and so forth. And then at the landscape scale, whether you're talking about the forest basin or an air basin, as it's sometimes called, or the watershed, or whatever it might be, managing the vegetation levels in that watershed, managing the hydration of the landscape within that area. So you have these three spatial scales that action has to take part on as well. This fifth perspective comes back to the scorecards that Derek referred to earlier, because all of the UN scorecards use these 10 headings as their sort of chapter headings. I'll go through them very quickly. The first is governance. Have you got the right people in the room? The second is, do you understand risk, what might happen, what the hazard is, what the exposure is, what the vulnerability is, both now and in the future, as one, climate change happens, and two, urban boundaries grow and extend and change as well. Essential number three is about your financial capacity, or as I sometimes call it, the financial architecture. Do you know where the money's going to come from? Have you got the right tax incentives? Have you got the right, do you fully understand co-benefits from improving wildfire resilience that can help you make the business case for it? Do you understand how to qualify for grants and loans and so forth, how to make your community creditworthy and so forth? So there's a number of different headings within the financial architecture. Another very important one is, have you got the right insurance cover? Increasingly an issue in California. Number four is about land use and building codes. Have you got the right ones? Are they fit for purpose? And do you enforce them? Number 5 is about the ecosystem services that can make your community more wildfire resilient, whether that is water features or natural forms of vegetation management by allowing them to be grazed or something like that, and things of that nature. Do you have some kind of wetland, a wetland area around your community that you could preserve because it might act as a fire buffer? Are you encouraging beavers? Is a common question that especially you get in rural areas, and a number of communities are now doing that for that reason. Number 6 is institutional capacity. Do you have the right skills? Do you have the right data? Are you physically able to become more resilient? Number 7 is the social dimension of this, cultural and social resilience, community engagement. Do you understand how to do it? How effective are you? How engaged is the community? And so forth. I live in a relatively affluent community here in the East Bay, Danville. We have considerable wildfire risk around us. Unfortunately, because the houses are a little bit larger here, people, other than in the street where I live, as it happens, people don't really check in with one another. In the event of a wildfire, that would be a major problem. So what's the degree of connectedness within the community? It's been shown repeatedly to be a major sort of determinant of how effective your response to a disaster might be. Essential number 8 is all of the physical infrastructure systems. How resilient are they? Are they fit for purpose? Do you understand how long they're likely to be out for in the event of a disaster? Have you got backup facilities for, let's say, water treatment or electricity or whatever it might be? Number 9 is then your actual event response. Is it coordinated? Do you have the right warning systems? Is it practiced? Do you have the right drills and so forth? And essential number 10 is expedite recovery and build back better. And interestingly, in all of my experience in using the UN scorecards, this is the essential that people routinely do least well. People fail to understand that there are certain things that you can predict quite readily in the aftermath of a wildfire that they could plan for in advance. For example, you know there are likely to be downed trees all over the place. Can you arrange for those to be hauled away via an MOU with a contractor in advance and get your prices locked in so you don't get gouged? You know there's going to be a huge amount of soil remediation. Can you arrange for contractors to do that in advance? In other words, to remove the toxic debris from house fires and burned cars and such. Can you arrange for that in advance? You know that if your water system has got fire retardant in it, it's going to take you 2 months to pump that clear of the fire retardant. Can you arrange for water tankers at pre-agreed rates in advance of the fire? Can you do all this stuff through standing arrangements, in other words, that you renew year on year? And there's a myriad other examples. Can you, if you know that the local, in a rural community, if you know that the local village store, come 7-Eleven, come ATM, come gas station, is at risk, can you arrange with the company that owns that for alternative, let's say, ATM facilities and so forth, and a million other sort of considerations that can be predicted in advance, but often are not. I'll say often, usually are not. So those are the 10 essentials. That is the 5th of the 6 perspectives that I wanted to cover. And then the 6th is what community engagement actually looks like. And I use the term, it's U-shaped. There's lots of top-down stuff. Everybody immediately gets to that in terms of government telling people what to do, warning them about this, collecting data, monitoring trends, and so on and so forth. There's a fair amount of bottom-up. The consultation, the feedback, advocacy, where communities communicate back to government what they need. And also things like crowdsourcing data on trends, sentiment, and so forth. The bit that is often forgotten is the piece along the bottom, the side to side. The people collaborating with each other and how you stimulate that, collective learning, interconnectedness, which I mentioned earlier. Self-help, group monitoring of readiness and service delivery. It can be stimulated by government, but the community has to grip that and own it for itself ultimately. And the job of government is then to stimulate that and keep it running without necessarily getting in the way. It's all too often forgotten. And the same point applies to businesses, and I will come back to that later on in what I'm saying. So those are the 6 perspectives of wildfire disaster risk reduction. How do they affect businesses? Well, the businesses may have, excuse me, just one second. Just want to move something out of the way. The businesses may have chronic stresses, whether it's revenue or insurance issues, that interact with their ability to deal with a wildfire. Business represents one system among many, but community business continuity requires multiple systems to be working. If the business is lost, the community suffers because it loses revenue and loses economic vitality. And I'll be saying a lot more about that shortly. Businesses may need to act at multiple timescales, whether it's reconstructing some business premise to make it premises or campus to make it more fire resistant, or whether it's down to just things like monthly workforce reminders on, hey, we're in the wildfire season, remember this, remember that, remember the other. So they need to act on multiple timescales. They need to act at different spatial scales. Their immediate assets or operating locations, or something further afield, road or rail access, or something like that. The landscape around their immediate location. So there's different spatial scales that a business might need to operate at also. Businesses may need to take action across any or all of the 10 essentials. They apply equally to business as they do to communities. And like people, businesses need to engage and be engaged. And I'll be saying, as I said, as I mentioned, I'll be saying a bit more about that. So those 6 perspectives apply in different ways, but equally to people, to the society, and to the business within a city or within a community. So then moving on to business and government engagement and the importance of it. Businesses rely on government to do their part in wildfire disaster risk reduction, but they fail oftentimes to realise that government can't do it all. By working with governments to make the communities in which they operate more resilient, businesses can reduce their own risk, and thereby they can protect their operations, they can maintain service, they can protect their assets or land, reduce their insurance and other costs. They can reduce their costs from replacing workers who move away after a wildfire. They can reduce health insurance costs from things like trauma, smoke inhalation, and so forth. And they can enhance their brand and be seen as good community stewards. So there's a lot in it for business to get involved in community wildfire risk reduction. But equally, government relies on business to do certain things. The business needs to stay in business to maintain economic and social vitality, to protect local taxation revenues, to provide insurance and financing for the community, potentially to help get the word out to their workforce on what people need to do. Businesses as a communication channel, in other words. Potentially, in some cases, some businesses to help with property hardening and things like that. So hardware retailers, building contractors, and so on. And also to provide certain sort of specific skills and input, which I'll come back to. The biggest contribution, though, that any business can make to wildfire, or for that matter, any other form of disaster risk reduction, is to stay in business. And as I'm fond of saying, business continuity planning is thereby community continuity planning. By staying in business, each individual company, each individual operation can protect the community's economic heartbeat, the commerce, the services, the jobs, the disposable incomes, and the local tax revenues. And that in turn protects consumers. It maintains social vitality and livability of the community. Any loss of business after any disaster, wildfires included, can cripple a community's recovery. It's not a wildfire example, but the GDP of New Orleans is only recently recovered to the level it was prior to Hurricane Katrina, because of all the businesses that went out of existence, and how long it took and the people who moved away because their employers had moved away, and how long it took for all of that to come back. So, as I'm fond of saying, business continuity planning is community continuity planning. Oh, excuse me. Small and medium enterprises are particularly at risk. They may only be insured for property losses, or they may be underinsured for property losses, and they may only have a few days or a few weeks, maybe at most a month or two's cash flow. and they may have few, if any, fallback options, especially if it's a tourist area. They may need the tourist income to survive, which obviously a wildfire is going to choke off, at least for some period. After disasters, this isn't just wildfires, but according to FEMA, 40 to 60% of small and medium enterprises don't reopen after a disaster. And conversely, the number of small, medium enterprises with a continuity plan, as of 2018 at least, if you talk to the National Small Business Association, it's 1/4 of them only. If you talk to FEMA, it's 35%. So there's nowhere near enough planning in advance. Business continuity planning goes on with small, medium enterprises, or for that matter, with larger ones. The impact of losing a small, medium enterprise in a small community can be completely devastating. The example I'm fond of using, and Derek's heard me say this before, is Sierraville in California. If you've ever been there, it's just about 45 miles north of Lake Tahoe, excuse me, 45 miles north of Truckee. It is a tiny little place. It has one gas station, one ATM, and one general store, and the nearest alternative is probably 25 miles away. If any of those get damaged, that community's taken an enormous economic hit, because you've now got to go 25 miles there and back, 50 miles, in other words, to get gas, 50 miles to get cash, 50 miles to go shopping, and so forth. And few people are going to be tempted to stick around under those conditions. They're going to move. And the community would basically slowly die. And that is the fate of a lot of rural communities that get caught up in some of these wildfires. Paradise is struggling to come back. It is coming back because there's quite a large population in that area that wants to live there again. But it's by no means a given. Similarly, workforce resilience is community resilience. Many businesses fail to consider their workforce. In Florida, some businesses actually lay in or provide vouchers for businesses, for workers to go and get things like plywood and tarpaulins and so forth in advance of oncoming hurricanes. Why wouldn't we do something like that for wildfires in the wildfire season? Because if workers can't get to work, or if they have to move, even if the business survives the fire, it still can't resume its operations. So it's in the business's interest to make sure that people can get to work, and they're not having to stay off work to rebuild or clear up the wreckage of their homes, or attend to their families who may have moved 25 miles away or something like that. It's absolutely in the worker's interest and in the business's own interest to make sure that the workforce is as resilient as it can be. There's a number of other things it can do there as well. I'm safe lines, insurance discounts, discount vouchers for things like landscape management, house hardening. The business itself could negotiate with the contractors that provide this work. Similarly, a similar idea in the UK, I know where I'm from originally, house moving companies will provide a book of vouchers to local chain stores like hardware stores and carpet shops and so on and so forth for people who are moving to use at their new location. That book of vouchers could frequently outweigh the actual cost of paying for the movers. It can frequently be more valuable than the cost of paying for the movers. And all it is the movers have basically spoken to these chains and said, look, give us 5% off. And once you assemble that, you make a material difference. You could do exactly the same kind of thing with wildfires. Assemble books of vouchers that your workforce could use to make their houses and themselves more wildfire resilient. Businesses can provide specific contributions. One, which I've already mentioned, is providing a communications channel. Businesses are going to have to engage and train their own workforce as part of their own business continuity planning. And that workforce is itself, of course, part of the community. It would be very easy for business continuity plan training to include messaging from governments, but for the community as a whole, the things I've just been talking about, how to harden a home, what grants and techniques are available, what evacuation routes there are, what to expect. And then perhaps the business could pass back feedback on how those messages are received. What are the gaps in the content? What leaves people still puzzled to help the local government become more effective? Possibly chambers of commerce could become involved in that kind of mechanism as well, working with batches of small businesses, especially at one time. Very little of this seems to happen. I kind of scratch my head and wonder why. There's also specific technical expertise. businesses are likely to have um, various skills that might be valuable. For example, project and program management, risk analysis, financial analysis, I might add accounting, adaptation and mitigation skills, how to access finance and insurance, or perhaps they could train smaller non-competitive businesses in business continuity planning. Some businesses are willing to contribute the skills that they've got. You see this in Japan a fair bit, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But it seems to happen very rarely. And yet again, it would be in the interests of each business to do that because they're helping to maintain the economic vitality of the community in which they're located, in which their workforce is located. So this whole system of systems thing, the social systems, the economic systems, the business systems, the physical systems, hopefully you're starting to see how it's all kind of interconnected. And if you think about the connections, all kinds of other interventions become possible. Businesses can help with event and post-event logistics. This does happen in Japan for post-earthquake support. But as I was saying, governments could create memorandum of understanding with local businesses for things like shelters, tree felling and removal, logistics, heavy equipment, excavators and so on, water tankers, data center space, accommodation, loss adjusters, engineers, financial management. IBM, actually, a little known fact, after the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, IBM actually ran the city of New Orleans payroll for 2 months because the New Orleans City Hall was completely out of action. They had no backup system for their payroll in-house. IBM was operating that payroll anyway on an outsourced basis, I believe. And we actually spotted them the cash to pay their workers for 2 months. Some Japanese cities do that kind of thing. They say, they'll have an agreement with local companies to say, hey, look, in the event that we declare a disaster, you company A, you're going to provide us with 3 bulldozers. You company B, you're going to provide us with a warehouse and so on and so on, whatever it might be. The key, though, as I was saying earlier, is to try to get this in the form of an advance agreement, a memorandum of understanding, with the pricing attached to it so that you don't get gouged, the city doesn't get gouged in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. Again, there's very, very little of that actually happens. It needs to happen more, in my opinion. Another area is workforce community volunteers. I don't work for PG&E, but I actually joined a PG&E crew clearing landscape on underbrush on Mount Diablo. But it could be undergrowth reduction or landscape management. It could be, if it's a building company, basic property hardening. Hey, can we help you by putting coverings over your gutters, mesh coverings over your gutters, or mesh coverings over your attic vents? Or it could be leafleting and community engagement type work. It could be help with drills and practices, or it could be, again, volunteering, the specialist technical skills I was just talking about. Companies report this kind of stuff as part of their corporate social responsibility reporting, assuming that's not actually dead at this point in the United States, but it's certainly alive in other parts of the world. There would seem to be plenty of scope to direct more and more of that to wildfire risk reduction. Another key area in the relationship between business and government is the importance of shared understandings. And just to explain the picture, the Alaska Railroad, I ran a scorecard workshop in Anchorage in Alaska when I was with IBM, and we were working jointly with AECOM, the big engineering company. And the city government of Anchorage had laid this thing on, and they had invited BP, who at that time had a big operation in Anchorage, Delta Airlines, Alaska Airlines, and a whole bunch of other companies that had big operations in Anchorage. And one of the things about Anchorage is they know that the port of Anchorage is seismically suspect. And they know that if there is a big earthquake, and as you're probably aware, Alaska is very prone to big earthquakes, the port is going to cease operation for some extended period. But everybody's backup plan was to use the Alaska Railroad as a way of getting supplies into town and getting finished product out of town. There's one big problem. That railroad is a single track railroad. there is no way it could handle all of the traffic that would have been required for it to function as an adequate backup to the port. So individually, every one of these companies had formed the assumption, hey, we'll use the railroad. Collectively, they had no backup plan at all because it would have failed. And that shows the importance of getting people together in the room in different businesses and government together and sharing the assumptions that they're working under so that they can be set down and stared at side by side. Hey, is this going to work or not? Other critical areas you might come to assumptions about who does what and assumptions about which metrics are we actually operating to here. Consistent assumptions about risk is a big one. The number of times I've encountered businesses that have completely different projections of risk than their local government has. And also completely different projections about how long infrastructure is likely to stay out of service after a disaster compared to what the government itself has. You need consistent understanding of financial needs and business cases. Why are we doing this? You need consistent understanding of where the risky areas are, what the risk zones are, and perhaps around the use of green infrastructure to improve the risk resilience of a particular zone. You need consistent understanding of ecosystem significance. So a business needs to understand that, hey, if we damage this ecosystem, or if we build out over this riparian area, we are minimizing the hydration potential for the landscape. We might be maximizing wildfire risk by doing that. Sharing of data and sharing of skills. Sharing and consistent communication with the workforce. You don't want businesses telling the workforce to do one thing and the city government telling them to do something else. It's got to be consistent. As I was just saying, consistent expectations of infrastructure performance. Hey, if we have a wildfire, you're going to be without sanitation for 2 weeks. You need to know that now, and you need to have a plan to deal with that. Those kinds of expectations. Consistent expectations of emergency response and what the roles are. What does a business need to do? What is the business's role in an emergency response, especially if it's a large operation like a refinery or some big plant like that? And then consistent and shared expectations of what will happen in the aftermath of a disaster and how long it's going to take to get the economy back on its feet. All of those areas are critical to the effective co-working of business and the community in up to and in the aftermath of a disaster. And it's also really important to recognize that businesses and the people that run them and work in them are just a cross-section of society. In any group of people, you're going to find some people that are willing to listen to wildfire DRR messaging, are able to understand risk, and are willing to be proactive. They're willing to take steps to protect properties and help protect their neighbours. And they're willing to volunteer, perhaps, as part of the community. And you're going to find people that are not. And likewise, I've spoken to businesses that immediately get how they need to engage with their communities. The UN DRR has just established a corporate community resilience officers network, which includes companies like Syngenta, Hyatt, Honeywell, Nestle, some really big companies that get the need to engage with their communities in their own interest. And yet I've also spoken to, in one case, a very large semiconductor company that you've heard of, and the chief risk officer at the location I was speaking to said, oh, well, that's the city government, that's the local government's job to deal with that. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know how much a fab costs, but last I heard, it was about $4 billion. Are you really entrusting that to the city government? And you get this incredible range of expectations and incredible gaps in understanding that you sometimes just leave you scratching your head. But then you get that in the community as well. So why would businesses be any different? And if you're working with business, you have to plan for that. And then coming back to the U-shaped model as it applies to businesses, the top down looks pretty much the same as it does from top down to the population as a whole. Data on risk, government capabilities to assist, encouragement for business continuity planning, as I was saying, economic assistance and incentives. The bottom up looks pretty much the same. Consultation, feedback, advocacy, offers of help, and so forth. But the side to side, chambers of commerce, insurers, campaigns, perhaps. Don't see too much of that. Group monitoring of readiness and fire abatement, and so on. Businesses helping one another to become more resilient. It's in their own interest to do it, because that's how they'll retain their workforces, because that's how the community will remain vibrant. So this sort of web of interacting causation becomes critical, and the idea is, how do you actually feed that? How do you maintain that web over time? And my final comment: business engagement is a process, yeah, but I've lost count of the number of people that seem to think it's a one-shot deal. And you have to look people in the eye and say, you're going to be doing that for the rest of your career. You do realize that, don't you? Because, people forget, people move, memories fade. You have to keep reviving the memory. You have to keep reviving the willingness to participate in community wildfire risk reduction. They're going to need to hear messaging multiple times. You might want to use workforce members as advocates within each business if you can. You might need to connect with businesses. You might need to connect businesses with each other. Hey, they're doing this, you want to do that. You might want to talk to each other, and so forth. You may need to offer incentives for things like business continuity planning, and it is a process that goes on forever. With small medium enterprises, it's doubly so, because their ability to absorb and react to risk may be less. They've certainly got less spare capacity to help you, and so forth. We've created, Arise has actually created a small medium enterprise engagement scorecard to understand how effectively the government is engaging with small medium enterprises, because some governments are very good, some governments are woeful. And we're trying to increase the quality of that engagement as it goes on. There we go. And that's as much as I had to say. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be delighted to take any questions.
Peter, thank you so much for, I think, a really insightful perspective on the wildfire problem. I think you touched on a few things that actually our previous speakers have related to community engagement, and gave a big and important wrinkle on the business side. So thank you for that presentation. And I'll open it up to questions from the audience. I have a few, but do the audience have any questions they could offer up? Okay, I will start, and people can still speak up after. So, as you know, I'm a fan of this work, and I guess one of the questions I have is a really broad one. How well prepared are U.S. cities? So, you've got a scorecard. You talk about really some important issues that need to be addressed, but how prevalent is the adoption, or even how many cities are actually doing this scorecard, and how many cities do you think are at least modestly prepared for the next disaster or wildfire? Or is it,
So take
need
one.
a lot of work?
So take one that I happen to know, South Lake Tahoe. I've watched their preparations over the years and their management of their undergrowth, and the vegetation around them. I can't speak to the level of social preparation within South Lake Tahoe, but I will say that if it's of the same quality as what they've done in the landscape around them, and indeed the work they seem to do with individual properties and so forth, it'll be first rate. And the value of that became clear during the Caldor fire, which, by the way, burned within about a mile of my left shoulder in the picture that in the background that I've got behind me, where the fire came over the ridge over Echo Summit and was heading towards South Lake Tahoe, and then all of a sudden veered off for the simple fact that there was fuel in a different direction, because South Lake Tahoe had so effectively managed the vegetation around it. That's not to say that they were protected from blowing embers, which is one of the biggest single risks in a wildfire, as you probably know, but they largely escaped unscathed. So there's an example of how good it is. As an example of how bad it is, well, Paradise prior to the last fire, I've got to believe they're better now. Lahaina was a special case, actually, partly because the alarm system they had in Lahaina was geared towards tsunami alerts, and they didn't dare use it because it would have driven people inland away from the tsunami towards the wildfire. And so that's one reason why so many people perished. But they were clearly completely underprepared. They didn't have enough pressure in their fire hydrants to fight the fire. So, the fire service was effectively rendered useless. I believe the same thing also happened in Altadena in California because they had a reservoir that was out of action. So I'd say in rare cases, communities are well protected. The average is nowhere near ready enough.
I guess, Peter, I guess, yeah, I appreciate this. I guess there's two folds. There's the preparedness in terms of home hardening, defensible space, and things like that. But can you speak of any gold standard communities that have thought through, for instance, MOUs? Like, do you see some?
No,
So there aren't. There,
no.
there there aren't really any. So I mean, because it sounds like really everything you said makes sense. But
Yeah.
how do you get communities to do it? And I guess a broader question, since you're in charge of Arise US, are there other places in the world a little bit better about this? Like, are they
Yeah.
better in Australia or in Europe?
So there are countries that are learning very fast because they've got an existential need to do that. Greece, Portugal, Spain, Australia,
Mhm.
Argentina, actually. Because they all have tremendous wildfire problems. Various towns and cities in California are belatedly anyway starting to get their act together, and some of the stuff they do is looking pretty good. There's also quite a lot of technology coming along now that should help, whole area sprinkler systems and so forth, being one that I was looking at the other day. So there's there are towns and cities that are starting to get it. The public's reaction is not always helpful. So um, the state of Oregon a few years back, you might have remember reading about this, published the updated wildfire risk maps, only to have to withdraw them in the face of the uproar of people discovering that their house values were on the line. Well, so what's going to win out? The housing market economics or the laws of physics? I rather think it's the laws of physics, but apparently not. Um, and it's so there's always that kind of thing. And it also remains to be seen how effectively each state will pick up the mantle, given that the current government wants to devolve a lot of FEMA's activities down to state and local level. That's not a priori a bad strategy. You could have a reasonable people could disagree about whether it's a good idea or not. In some respects, it might very well be a good idea, but only if the local end of that equation is capable of discharging what it's got to do.
Yeah.
And it's by no means clear. And that's another aspect in all of this.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I think I agree with everything said. You already touched on something I was going to ask about in terms of the government response, but I don't know. It seems like you raised a really important issue here. So, you can imagine that you've home hardened, you've created defensible space as a community, and you do well. You do well in the event of a fire, yet you still have to rebuild. So I think this is something that's really missing, I think, from the big picture perspective. I have one more question, but does the audience have anything? I don't want to dominate the conversation here. Did any audience have any other questions before I ask my final one?
Yeah, I can ask a question. Hi, Peter. I came into the talk a little late, and so just grasping a bit of it. But I appreciate your analogies here of how we've learned from different disasters, and also the idea that business resilience, workforce resilience is community resilience. I like that. Um, I was wondering if you had any early thoughts on what LA did well in the aftermath of, in terms of business resilience, where there are areas of improvements. And maybe you spoke about this, but any early thoughts? I know we're all still kind of trying to document and learn from everything, but if you have any thoughts on that. And then I think you had mentioned, my second question is, I think you had mentioned the scorecards, which I'm not totally familiar with, but I get the concept of. And I wonder if you've done any work on quantifying changes in the scorecards over time because of how communities have adopted different measures, and whether there are measures that are weighted stronger than others because of the way that it supports the resilience of businesses more than others.
Great
So
question, Jessica. Partly what I was going to ask. That's great.
so Well, there were several questions there. What went well in LA? I haven't the story of LA has yet to be told. And inevitably, all I know is what's in the press, and inevitably the press focuses on what didn't go well. You know, the fact that they managed to stop the fire when they did, I suppose you could count. We would say was a major was pretty much a major triumph, notwithstanding the damage that happened, before they were able to stop it. So I will duck that question because the honest answer is I don't authoritatively know. I only know what I read. I haven't been down to LA, and so on. So I'm kind of waiting to find out, just like a lot of people, I suspect. I do know some of the problems that they've had will repay being looked at, the alert and warning systems that weren't received, and so forth. That issue they had with the water supply for firefighting because they had a reservoir out of service, and so forth. But there's going to be things inevitably in any city. You're going to get stuff like that happened. But the long and the short of it was the place has been built over 100 years or more, in the wrong fashion for the kind of environment in which it's located. How are you going to change that now? Interestingly, actually, Derek, going back to your previous question about what a city's starting to do well, the city of Berkeley has just published an ordinance that's for all the houses along the ridge there at the back of Berkeley that in the area that burned, about 40 years ago in that big fire that they had there. They are now going to ban vegetation within 5 feet of a house and mandate a shingle barrier or at least a non-flammable barrier, not mulch anyway, around the house. I've not heard of any other city doing that yet. So that's a first. I know some communities in LA have started to do that as well. So good. That's an example that's going to happen. It'll happen in my area sooner or later as well. And I'm the same as everybody else. I've got a jasmine growing up with my house, which I love, but it's going to have to come down. When they built this development, everybody thought it was a great idea to plant redwood trees around the place, thinking they'd be cute. Little realizing that over 30 years, they grow to be about 100 feet high. And little realizing that although a red was relatively fireproof at the base level, a burning ember hits that 50 feet up, you just create yourself a 100-foot tiki torch, which is not really what you want right next door to your house. So, this community is in for a rude awakening as well, I suspect. Going on to your second question about using the scorecards. So when we publish the scorecards, we purposely don't use them for benchmarking. And there's a simple reason for that, which is that we want people to use them. And if you know that your city is going to do badly and the results might be public, you're probably not going to use it, because that's human nature. And we say that if cities want to benchmark their own scores against one another, they're perfectly at liberty to do that, but we're not going to do it. Neither have we maintained the scores over time because we don't actually know who's using it. It's completely in the public domain. You can go to a website and download it. You could go and download it today, Jessica, and use it for whatever, and we wouldn't know. What I can tell you is that when we've done surveys, there are certain interesting trends that emerge. I referred to a couple of them, actually. One is that Essential 10 is routinely done the least well of any of them. One is that community engagement is not seen as a continuous process. One is that business engagement is nowhere near as effective as it could be. And there's a number of others. One is you'd be amazed the number of communities that actually don't look far enough for financing. There is more financing around to do this stuff than most communities realize. It's just a matter of going and finding it. And that's true in the US, that's true in the European Union, that's true in developing countries. There is more money there than people think, as it turns out. So there are some universal constants, so to speak, that emerge. Governance. There's always some important group of stakeholders that isn't at the table. Whether that's the local utility company, because they know, or the local cell phone company. Looking at you, AT&T, who they're notoriously sort of want to keep themselves separate. Or whether it's some less advantaged community from within the city, an ethnic community or disabled people or something like that. There is almost always one important group at least that is not there at the table. So those are some of the kind of universal truths that that come out of it, that come immediately to mind.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Peter. And thanks for the question, Jessica. So just one more follow-up, if we have a little time here, is coming back to the recovery. And I guess, Jessica's question sort of mirrored something I was thinking about is anyone, I assume Rye's not doing it, but do you know of anyone doing work looking at recovery? So maybe it could be a revision to your scorecard ultimately of how well communities do recover after a wildfire. And as you spoke of your examples, I would think that Paradise, as you said, is what, 30% recovered after 8 years.
I think so. Yeah.
I'm wondering, maybe this is a research problem. Jessica, we can talk to Michael. Let's get a great research grant. How do we look long-term the recovery of, say,
I would think
Pacific
great.
Palisades or Altadena, right? So different resources, different finances. And like you said, there are finances available, but from what I've understood in some of the stuff we've done with our class, a lot of communities, namely counties, are not resourced to go look for those resources. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of not being able to get the finance even though they exist. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that and
Yeah.
how we learn from that and how we spread out this knowledge and information to very different levels of wealth in communities, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I'd have one immediate perspective on it, which comes back to the business versus community thing. When a business does business continuity planning, at least when it does it well, it's planning how to get its operations up and running after the event. It's planning right through the event, so to speak, to how to resume normal activity afterwards. It might forget a few things, and I've covered some of them, but in principle, that's what they're trying to do. When a government thinks about planning for a disaster, it plans up to the event and the immediate aftermath, and just does not think about resuming normal activity, the economic reboot, the social reboot of the community, and how much of that they can plan for in advance. So there's a whole topic around that you could get involved in. Why is that? What could governments actually be doing that is analogous? I was using the term earlier, business continuity planning is community continuity planning. But if there was a discipline of community continuity planning, what would be in it that isn't there today? And the answer is a hell of a lot, actually. So what would the content of that be? So yeah, if you wanted to think about this as a research topic, there's a lot of meat there to go at. There really is.
Yeah, I think there's gonna be a lot to learn. I said, yeah, I think the jury's still out, but at least personally, I'm gonna be watching, right? You have two communities in LA.
Yep.
You would say, relatively speaking, maybe in an American way, very, well-to-do communities, but I think Altadena is very different than Pacific Palisades. So I'll be interested in seeing how those two very nearby communities recover.
My understanding is that Altadena is not as wealthy as Pacific Palisades.
Yes, that's what I was subtly referring to.
Right.
A
So
very different demographic of people who own homes there or owned.
By God, money helps, right? I would expect that Pacific Palisades will recover quite a lot faster. But there's going to be people in both places that go, you know what, this isn't the community I knew. I'm moving. I'm out of here. And
Yeah.
that way. Now, Pacific Palisades, I suspect, will attract new residents pretty fast because it's Pacific Palisades. Altadena, don't know.
Yeah, I mean, again, I only read the news. There's a lot of anecdotes of people that are underinsured, so they're selling their property. So there are some people speculating right now, right? Okay,
There's speculation and there's outright scams.
Yeah, that's right.
Unfortunately, that's
Anyway, Peter, thank you so much for your time, for your very insightful perspective on this. Thank you to the audience for their questions and their comments. This is recorded, so those of you in YouTube land, hope you're enjoying this. We've got 2 more great talks this quarter. Next week, we're going to go back to a little bit of basic research, but we're going to talk about whether fire breaks really work. So we're going to talk about sort of the fluid mechanics of ember casting, and a Stanford alum is going to come talk about her research, which actually is related to some current Stanford researchers in that area. Stay tuned for that. Thanks again for your attention. Thank you again, Peter, for your time. We'll look forward to having you join us in the upcoming 2 weeks. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.